Imagine it. The year is 1853. Queen Victoria asks for chloroform during her 8th delivery, opening a floodgate of acceptance for women needing pain management during their deliveries. Austria decides to no longer allow Jews to possess land. The Crimean War starts. In Ukraine, the very first surgery taking place at night happens with the new kerosene lamps. And the first passenger train in India opens up. New Zealand holds its very first election. And speaking of first, Canada is publishing the Provincial Freeman, which is an anti-slavery newspaper, and it's actually published and edited by the continent's first African-American woman. Stateside in New York, Solomon Northup, who is the author of 12 Years a Slave, was finally freed thanks to the governor of New York after being held illegally as a slave for 7 years. The first horse-drawn fire engine with a hose enters service. And John Wilkes Booth, a name we'll hear again later, was baptized. A U.S. whaling ship is the first to land on Antarctica. And Cincinnati is the first city to employ full-time firefighters. Gail Borden is the first to patent the process for condensing milk. And the National Black Convention meets in New York. William Wells Brown is the first African American to publish a novel in North America. Central Park is created, as are potato chips. The first electric telegraph is sent in California, and just when you thought you heard the last of Andrew Jackson, here's one more. His first statue dedicated to him is erected. And finally, the Dark Horse is inaugurated. You may be shocked to learn that this period in time is referred to as the time of apparent tranquility. And the reason is Franklin Pierce here, he just barely captured the popular vote. So he was looking for a way to kind of usher in some peace after the recent compromise and all the issues surrounding slavery and all the problems. He really wanted to usher in an era of peace and prosperity for everyone, right? And that might also have a personal meaning for him. You see, just before he left for D.C. to be inaugurated as the new president, tragedy struck the Pierce family, and his 11-year-old son, Benjamin Pierce, passed away in a train accident. In fact, it was such a big deal, though, that they reported that he was the one that died, along with his son. But Franklin, his wife Jane, and Benjamin all were in the train car. It hit some rocks. It rolled off an embankment about 15 feet down, and the son was the only one who didn't make it. In fact, when Franklin, and they didn't even have any serious injuries, so it's extra tragic that one person ended up dying. Anyway, when he saw his son laying there nearly decapitated, he covered him up so that his wife wouldn't see. It's just, his son was 11, and what makes this even more tragic is this was the only surviving son. The other 2 sons had died in infancy or very, very young, and so at 11 years old, they lost their last one. Definitely not the way you want to start your presidency, of course, but he felt that it was his duty to continue on, even though it caused a lot of problems internally in his marriage because his wife believed it was a punishment from God. He actually did too, and during his inauguration, he wouldn't even put his hand on the Bible. He refused because he believed he was being punished, but he still felt like he had to do it. Franklin Pierce was a Northerner who tried to incorporate Southerners deeply into his advisor cabinet because he wanted to look like there was a unification here. But it takes a lot more than just who you're talking to and who you have connections with to gap that divide. So Pierce started pushing for weird things, like getting Great Britain to give up any claim in Central America and trying to get Spain to sell Cuba. This was confusing people, and they weren't exactly happy. All of that didn't matter once the Missouri Compromise was repealed. Now, if you remember, the Missouri Compromise was meant to say no more slavery west or north going forward, right? So when you repealed it, that was opening a scab of something we thought was healing, the slavery thing. Remember our compromise from 1850? This kind of throws everything back into chaos around slavery again. Weirdly enough, a lot of this is because of a railroad wanted by Senator Stephen Douglas. He was a senator of Nebraska, and he wanted a railroad that went from Chicago through to California. And he wanted it passed through Nebraska. And in pushing this, that's what led to all of this chaos. A name we will hear again, Jefferson Davis, was the current Secretary of War. And he wanted a railway too, but he wanted it through the South. And he used his influence over the president to get more territory from Arizona. Well, from Mexico, that would be the bottom part of Arizona. He sent an envoy, Franklin did, to spend $10 million on land so that this railway could go. Senator Douglas still wanted his railway going through Nebraska. So this started another conflict because he was supporting this in an effort to get states their own rights, and because states would have their own rights, they could decide on the slavery question, and that's where all this came up again. Therein started the race towards Kansas. If you've ever heard the phrase bleeding Kansas, that's where this phrase originated, because both Northerners and Southerners were just beside themselves to get to Kansas as fast as they could and trying to create a majority so that they could decide slavery or non-slavery based on how many people were there from which area. Bleeding Kansas actually ended up being the first glimpse of what would be the Civil War. By the end of his presidential term, the drama in Kansas had calmed down, but it wasn't enough to have the Democrats nominate him again as their lead for the Democratic Party. Tune in for the next video where we discuss the last president to try and stop a war that would eventually happen anyway.